Now, our conditional statements can get more complex than just a simple if-else. Sometimes you want more than just two possible paths. Sometimes you have 3, 4, 5 paths that you might want to take. So to do this, you can add additional conditions by using what's called an if-else statement. What this looks like is this. So we have, again, if followed by a first Boolean condition and our brackets. And then we have an else if followed by a second Boolean condition and brackets. We can have as many else ifs as we want, each one followed by brackets. And then we have the option of including a final else without the if and brackets. Essentially what happens here is when we hit this if-else-if statement, we check the first condition. If condition 1 is true, then we would do the code inside the first brackets and then skip the rest. Don't even evaluate any of it, and we would just jump to the first line of code after this whole block. So you can think about an if-else-if-else as a whole block that goes together. And if condition 1 is true, the rest of the block is totally skipped, and we just go to the line of code right after it. So we never even evaluate these other conditions. If, on the other hand, condition 1 is false, well, then we have to check the next one. We check to see if condition 2 is true. If condition 2 is true, then we would execute the code inside here and then still skip the rest of the blocks and pick up at the next line after the whole big block. If condition 2 is true, we've already checked condition 1, it's false. I'm sorry, if condition 2 is also false, we then move on to check condition 3. And if it was true, we'd execute the code inside there and then skip the rest and pick back up right after the whole block. But if condition 3 is also true, so again, we've checked 1 and it's false, 2 is false, 3 is false, then else is kind of like a default. We go right in and we just execute the code in the else, and we pick up right after the whole big block is done. Notice because the last check here is an else, there's nothing to check. There is no condition 4. This is, again, just sort of like a default. If this one's false and this one's false and this one's false, well, then do what's in the else. Okay, so if you're doing the code inside of here, we know that this is condition 1 being true. To get inside this block, we know that not only is condition 2 true, but we also know that condition 1 is false, because we never would have even reached checking condition 2 if condition 1 was true. So inside here means condition 1 is false and condition 2 is true. If we've reached inside of this part of the block, it means that condition 1 is false, condition 2 is false, and condition 3 is true. If we've reached inside this part of the block, then we know that both condition 1, condition 2, and condition 3 are all false. So the if-else-if essentially allows you to just specify different conditions and then associate actions with those conditions. You can include a final default else, but you could also leave this off. So if you just wanted to take 3 actions, condition 1, 2, and 3, if you just want to take 3 actions based on 3 conditions, 1, 2, and 3, but you didn't want to have a default, you would just leave this piece off, and that's how you would do that. So here are the basic rules of what's allowed. You're allowed to have a single if statement with no else. And this means that if that if is true, if the condition is true, what's inside will execute, and if it's not true, nothing will execute. You can have a single if with a single else, meaning one of 2 paths will always execute. If the condition is true, path A will execute, and if the condition is false, path B will execute. 1 or 2 things will always happen. You can have a single if with any number of else ifs and a single else. With this construction here, one of these paths will always happen. So if you have 1 if, 3 else ifs, and an else, so basically 5 different paths that you can take, one of those 5 paths will always happen. You can also have a single if with any number of else ifs and no else. And this means that, let's say you have a single if and 3 else ifs. You're providing 4 possible paths, but it's also possible that none of them will ever be executed. Because if you don't include an else, it's possible that all of your conditions will be false and you'll just skip over the whole block. Now remember, with all of these different ways to structure conditionals, again, they're matched up based on their brackets. So the brackets are what matters from the syntax perspective, from the perspective of the compiler. but indentation is really helpful for humans. So I encourage you to be very careful with your indentation as well. Now, if and else if structure, these are consecutive checks, right? So we check condition 1. If it's false, we check condition 2. If it's false, we check condition 3, and so on. But we can also have what's called nested conditionals. So nested conditionals are putting one conditional block inside of another conditional block. With nested conditionals, it's extra important to be careful about your brackets and indentation for both your human readers and for the compiler. If you're going to have nested conditionals, please just don't use no brackets. Be sure to use brackets because it gets very complicated trying to match things up once they're nested. Nested conditionals, basically the same rules apply. You just treat each new conditional block as kind of independent once you reach it. So let's take a look at a little example. Here's an example of both some nested conditionals as well as some if-else-if structured conditionals. So here we have one big if block without an else. So what's going to happen first is we're going to evaluate if C1 is true, and if it is, we're going to get inside this whole big block here, this matched with this. Again, the indentation doesn't matter from the compiler perspective, but you can see in this example how important it is from the human perspective. So assuming this is true, we get in here and we just start executing code. We would execute any code that's here, and now we'd hit another if statement. Well, we essentially just evaluate this if statement completely independently of the outer if statement. So this is what's called nested, because this if statement is nested inside this outer one, but we evaluate them independently of each other. So if we make it inside this first outer if statement, we evaluate the inner one completely independently, completely on its own. So here our same rules apply. Well, we check to see if C2 is true. If C2 was false, we would jump down to the else statement that's paired with this inner conditional, and we would execute what's here. We know if we reach this part of the conditional, we know that C1 is true, because that's the only way we could have gotten even into this second conditional, and we also know that C2 is false. If C2 was true, we'd go inside this conditional block and start executing what's inside there. So again, we know that if we've made it in here, we know that both C1 and C2 are true, because that's the only way we'd be able to make it to this point of the code. And then we'd execute whatever code is here. And now here we have a third nested block. This one's an if-else-if-else structure. But again, we just evaluate it completely independently. So once we hit this nested if statement, it doesn't matter how we got there, right? We just evaluate these conditions completely on their own. So if we reach this part of the code, we know that the only way we could have reached it is if C1, C2, and C3 were all true. If C3 is true, we evaluate or we execute this code here. If C3 is false, we check C4. If it's true, we evaluate the code here. If it's false, we check C5. And if it's true, we evaluate the code here. And if it's false, then we did include here a default, so we would execute the code that's there. So again, you can see how brackets are really important. Because they group everything together and they help us understand, well, they define which parts of the conditionals are linked to each other. But the indentation is really important too, because it helps the reader understand what's going on.